Good evening and welcome to the virtual Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Will Frankel, and I'm one of your 3 Athenaeum Fellows this year. One of the greatest weaknesses in mainstream economic thought, critics have argued for decades, is its supposed reliance on far-fetched assumptions. From John Maynard Keynes to Joseph Schumpeter to students in the lecture hall of introductory economics courses today, thinking about marginal utility as a way to measure value and happiness in particular can seem slippery. Thankfully, internalizing this criticism, some economists have made great strides in nuancing the field's understanding of well-being and incorporating these findings into economic thought. Tonight's speaker is one such economist. Dr. Fengyu Wu is a research associate at the Eudaimonia Institute at Wake Forest University. Her research centers on the economics of happiness, health economics, development economics, and political economy. She studies the determinants of subjective well-being in populations around the world, and in particular, the effects of both economic and social conditions, including, among others, income, consumption, interpersonal comparisons, supportive relationships, and social capital. She also investigates the factors that influence individuals' socioeconomic attitudes and political preferences, with special attention on identifying and explaining differences between men and women. She's one of the founding members of the China Happiness Report, and she also contributed to the World Happiness Report 2021. She teaches student seminars on the social science of happiness at Wake Forest University. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Southern California and a bachelor's in economics from the Singapore Management University. Dr. Wu's Athenaeum talk is the final installment of a 3-part series on interdisciplinary perspectives on happiness, co-sponsored by the Berger Institute at CMC. Using the written Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, we will be accepting questions throughout the program to be posed towards the end of the event. Preference will go to students, so when you send a question, please state your affiliation with the college. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recordings are strictly prohibited. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Fengyu Wu to the Athenaeum.
Hello, everyone. I'm Fengyu Wu, and thank you very much for having me here today. So I'm going to talk about happiness and economics in today's talk. Here is today's agenda. I'm going to first talk about measures of well-being in economics, both the traditional approach and the new approach, which is the subjective well-being. Second, I'm going to compare measures of well-being, GDP per capita versus subjective well-being. And I'm going to do it by showing you 2 case studies. Finally, I will briefly discuss the key determinants of subjective well-being from the perspective of the economists. So let's get started. First, let's look into the measures of well-being economics. Many of us may know that GDP per capita is considered the traditional and standard measure of well-being by economists. And here, GDP per capita is defined as the value added created through the production of goods and services in a country during a certain period. This measure has the advantage of being objective, meaning that it is obtained from sources other than the individual's personal assessment. However, does this measure provide accurate insight into how well off people actually feel? Probably not. There is a report by the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, which involve several leading economists, include at least 6 Nobel Prize winners in economics. And this report suggests a measure that can complement GDP. So they suggest the measure should reflect economic production and economic performance. Second, it should measure non-market goods and services. Third, it should emphasize on society's true valuation instead of market price. Fourth, this should measure people's well-being and quality of life. Last but not least, this measure should be an indicator of sustainability. This means it should measure well-being over time in its economic, environmental, and social dimensions. Here is a quote from the report. The Commission believes that, in addition to objective indicators of well-being, subjective measures of the quality of life should be considered. So here, I would like to introduce you the concept of subjective well-being. Subjective well-being refers to how people experience the quality of their lives. From now on, I will use SWB to stand for subjective well-being, just to be concise. There are three dimensions of subjective well-being: life evaluation, affect, and eudaimonia. Life evaluation stands for a reflective assessment on a person's life or some specific aspect of it. Affect is a person's feeling or emotional state during a point in time. So the main difference from between life evaluation and affect is mainly about the time horizon. And the eudaimonia is a person's meaning and purpose in life. These days, a number of universities, research institutes, and international organizations have started to collect data on subjective well-being. For example, the US General Social Survey, the World Value Survey, the Gallup organization, the German Socioeconomic Panel, the Household Income Labor Dynamics in Australia, and the China Family Panel study. Next, I would like to elaborate a little bit more about some specific measures of subjective well-being. Let's first look into the measures of life evaluation. There are three typical questions about life evaluations from public opinion surveys: the overall happiness, life satisfaction, and ladder of life. As far as I'm concerned, overall happiness is one of the most oldest survey questions available. This question is taken from the US General Social Survey. Taking all things together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say you are very happy, pretty happy, and not too happy? Here in our economic research, we code 3 as very happy, 2 as pretty happy, and 1 as not too happy. So the response scale of this question is from 1 to 3. Next, it's about the life satisfaction. Life satisfaction is also one of the most widely used survey questions by economists on life evaluation. This question is taken from the World Values Survey. All things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? So here, the response scale ranges from 1 to 10, with a higher level representing a higher level of life satisfaction. And other surveys have other kinds of response scales as well. For example, in some of the surveys in China, they use response scales from ranges from 1 to 5. the last one is the ladder of life question. For this question, it is in fact the question that's used in the famous World Happiness Report to do the ranking across countries all over the world. So this question is, please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom and 10 at the top. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. On which step of the ladder would you say you personally feel you stand at this time? Here, the response scale ranges from 0 to 10. Next, let's look into the measures on affect or emotional state. This is a question taken from the Gallup US Daily. Now, please think about yesterday, from morning until the end of the day. Think about where you were, what you were doing, who you were with, and how you felt. The first 5 questions are about the positive emotions. Did you feel well rested yesterday? Were you treated with respect all day yesterday? Did you smile or laugh a lot yesterday? Did you learn or do something interesting yesterday? Did you experience enjoyment a lot of the day yesterday? These are all yes or no questions. And the next 5 questions are about a person's negative emotion. Did you experience physical pain, worry, sadness, stress, or anger a lot of the day yesterday? Finally, we look into the measures on eudaimonia. There is a purpose well-being score from the Gallup US Daily. On these 5 statements, together are what we call the purpose well-being score. There is a leader in my life who makes me enthusiastic about the future. I like what I do every day. In the past 12 months, I have reached most of my goals. I get to use my strengths to do what I do best every day. I learn or do something interesting every day. So respondents answered yes or no to these statements. And we code 1 as yes and 0 as no and sum them up. So the purpose well-being score ranges from 0 to 5. Here is another example on the measure of eudaimonia from UK Office of National Statistics. Overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? The response scale also ranges from 0 to 10. So nowadays, a number of official national statistics in countries, especially in OECD countries, have those subjective well-being measures. This table shows you the list of countries that have those measures. Here, life evaluation is mostly available in those countries, and affect and eudaimonia measures are less available. Researchers and policymakers prefer the life evaluation measures for quite a few reasons. First, we find that the life evaluation measures are highly reliable, meaning that they have higher retest score than some of the widely used measures in economics. So what is test retest? If we ask a person about his or her overall happiness today, and a few days later, a few weeks later, or even a few months later, we find that his or her answer to overall happiness or life satisfaction question are highly consistent over time. Next, we also find life evaluation measures to be valid. This means that the answers from the respondent, him or herself, are highly correlated with the evaluations of those of others who know the respondent well. For example, his or her friends or family members. Third, those life evaluation measures can be compared across different groups of peoples. One evidence for this is that the sources of happiness or life satisfaction are much the same for most people all over the world. These factors include living conditions, family, health, and work. With those in mind, I'm going to briefly compare subjective well-being measures, in particular, the life evaluation measures with the GDP. And I'm going to do it through two case studies. First, the UX experience from 1973 to 2012. Second, China's experience from 1990 to 2010. And I'm going to also briefly discuss about some policy implications in these two case studies. First, US experience from 1973 to 2012. Here, your left-hand side panel is a figure of real GDP per capita during the whole period. We can see, despite some fluctuations around the long-term trend itself is almost upward sloping. So what about the subjective well-being of the general US population? We look into the overall happiness measure taken from the General Social Survey. Here, we also see the short-run trend, the short-run fluctuations of the overall happiness, but the long-run trend of this measure is almost flat or even downward sloping. So if we put these two series into the same picture, we can get something like this. So we find that the short-run fluctuation of GDP and overall happiness are almost the same between the two series, but the long-run trends of these two measures are very different. Here is our conclusion from the first case study. In recession and recovery, subjective well-being measures are here, our overall happiness measure and GDP move together, but the long-run trends are quite different. Next, let's look into China's experience from 1990 to 2010. Many of us may know that China has experienced remarkable economic growth during the period. For example, if you believe in the official statistics of China, the growth in GDP per capita is over 8% per year. And the per capita GDP and consumption in China increased by at least fourfold. What about the subjective well-being measures. Here is a figure taken from Eastling 2012. This figure shows you the mean life satisfaction of the Chinese general population in 6 series taken from 6 surveys conducted in China. Even though all these 6 series have different periods of coverage, we can observe that life satisfaction in Chinese population during the whole period form a U shape, meaning that it declined from 1990 to around 2000 to 2005, and then turned upward. So another observation is the long-run trend of the subjective well-being measure declined somewhat during the period. This is most obvious if you look at the trend for the word value survey, the top curve. So in fact, this pattern of movement of the U-shape pattern for the life satisfaction in China is similar to those in other transition countries such as Russia and East Germany during their transition period. A further look into the trend and the U-shaped pattern of the Chinese mean life satisfaction score, and think about the underlying reasons of this pattern. We find that this U-shaped pattern is related to a few factors or the developments in China. First, there was a pronounced rise in unemployment, followed by a mild decline. That is, the unemployment rates in the Chinese population form a hill shape, while the life satisfaction among the Chinese population formed a U shape. Next, there was a decline in safety net benefits provided by the employers when workers lost their jobs, when workers shifted to private sectors, and when state enterprises were restructured. So here is our conclusion from the case 2 study. In China, like in other transition countries, it suffered from a substantial increase in unemployment and a collapse of a social safety net during the period of unprecedented income growth. And we observe that the subjective well-being measures are able to capture the effect of these developments on people's life. However, GDP per capita cannot. Finally, we look into the key determinants of subjective well-being or overall happiness. I would like to make the acknowledgement that I'm going to discuss the determinants from the perspective of the economists. First, from numerous studies by economists, we find that there are big 7 factors for people's subjective well-being or overall happiness at individual level. The first one is family relationships, followed by financial situation, work, community and friends, health, personal freedom, and personal values. The first 5 are ordered by their importance in people's overall happiness. there are other factors that can affect people's overall happiness. For example, social comparison and adaptation. Social comparison means that we tend to compare our own situation with situations of our peer group. Adaptation means we tend to adapt to our past situations. And researchers have found that social comparison and adaptation are detrimental to our overall happiness. And they are mostly involved in financial situation and our work. So one suggestion from the economists would be we should focus on improving the situation, the factors that are less involved in social comparison and adaptation. For example, family relationship, community and friends, and health. And we also find there are certain factors that do not matter that much to people's subjective well-being or overall happiness. These factors are age, gender, looks, IQ, and education. I don't want to say that these factors do not matter at all. These are just not as important as the factors I just mentioned. Next, let's look at the key determinants of subjective well-being or overall happiness at the country level. We have found that at country level, there are 6 factors, include divorce rate, unemployment rate, level of trust, membership in non-religious organizations, quality of government, and fraction believing in God. If you look closely and think carefully, you may find that these 6 factors are almost parallel to the big 7 factors that are important to people's happiness at the individual level. Here are some takeaways from today's presentation. First, the economists have found that the subjective well-being measures, especially life evaluation measures, are able to capture the effects of developments on people's life. Second, when we think about the measures of well-being, we should not only think about GDP per capita, but also consider subjective well-being measures. Last but not least, researchers have found that family relationships, work, community and friends, and personal values are important to subjective well-being, both at individual level and at country level. So here are some references and materials I would like to share with you if you are interested in the topics of happiness. These are not only from economists, but also from researchers of other fields, such as philosophy and psychology. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fengyu, for that wonderful presentation. We're now just going to shift to some audience Q&A. So the first question comes from a parent asking, how does your conception of subjective well-being relate to gross national happiness in Bhutan?
That's a very good question. I would say it is indeed highly related to my topic. And that is actually Bhutan's gross national happiness is also one way or one measure of subjective well-being, I will say. So it's actually one idea from the topic of happiness. Thank you.
One of the reasons traditional GDP per capita measurement is a nice way to measure societal welfare is because we have lots of research on how different policies might affect GDP already. What progress has been made in evidence-based policy making measured by SWB? Do higher taxes, more welfare spending, or less land use regulation increase or decrease societal happiness?
That's a very good question. So I would elaborate a little bit more about what I have learned and what I have researched to respond this question. People have found that like more welfare states benefits are highly related or positive related to people's happiness. What's more ambiguous from the current research finding is about tax. So I would not touch more about that, but for policy implications in general, we find unemployment rate is highly negative related with happiness, divorce rate highly negative related to happiness, and as what I said, the welfare states are highly positive related to happiness. Others, like the fraction of believing in God, is positive related to happiness. So in fact, there are a lot of studies at the macro level have investigated those policy implications. Thank you.
How do we know that my 7 out of 10 SWB is the same as yours? If internal assessment of SWB varies across individuals, might it be systematically biased by overweighting people with, for instance, personality types that lead them to overstate how happy or unhappy they are at a given moment?
That's a very question. So if you remember in my talk, I briefly mentioned those measures, those life evaluation measures such as overall happiness and life satisfaction are preferred by economists or other researchers because they are highly comparable across groups of people. But this does not mean my happiness is comparable to yours. I will not say it's highly comparable at the individual level, but on average, it's comparable, for example, between people of different races, between people of different gender, between people from different countries. So I will make this statement that the happiness measures, if we want to use it like robustly or scientifically, it is only comparable at the group level. And researchers kind of try to account for differences in personality through some techniques. For example, at the individual level analysis, we try to capture some individual unobservables, such as personality, by controlling for individual fixed effects. So we do find that it's not, if we look at the measure or the responses by themselves, we cannot compare one person to another. But through some scientific method, we can control for those characteristics. Thank you.
Let's suppose that the only reason we care about raising people's incomes is because it makes their lives more pleasant, which seems fairly reasonable. And suppose further that some polling indicates that very poor people report equal levels of subjective well-being to folks at other levels of income. Do you think that this finding would suggest we should stop trying to reduce poverty? And if not, would you acknowledge then that some kind of objective factors about our well-being more fully capture what it means to be well off?
That's also a very good question. So I would not suggest to stop ending poverty because we find that at the very when people are poor or for those who are in the bottom of the income quintile or quartile, increase their income can still raise their happiness. But there is a threshold for those people who already have the level of income that can sustain their material well-being. Other factors play bigger roles. And in particular, I think income is important because it can like meet people's basic needs through some basic income. But for people in the middle class or higher, in fact, income is not as important compared with other factors such as family life and friends or leisure. And in fact, I would say because income is very subject to social comparison and adaptation, those elements. So we probably should not focus a lot, focus more on income than other factors when we get enough money to sustain our life.
Do the components of subjective well-being relate to happiness in the same way across cultures?
That's a good question as well. As I explained, across different cultures, they, in fact, subjective well-being, when they think about happiness, they actually think similarly. A few studies in the economic literature or other literature, researchers have found that the key determinants of happiness are consistent across culture. These are being employed, have family life, have friends, and health. So these are the common elements that people across culture think are important. So I would say, in general, it can be compared across cultures. Thank you.
You mentioned that American overall subjective well-being is mostly flat and slightly downward sloping in recent decades. This trend might be observed because though people's lives are getting better, their expectations for how comfortable their lives ought to be are rising apace. If that were the case, would you argue that American economic growth over the past few decades has been basically pointless?
That's a very interesting question. So GDP, of course, is a way to measure material well-being. But the point of my presentation is that this may not be necessary to reflect people's true feeling. So in my presentation, I don't want to overemphasize. We don't need to look into GDP per capita because it's still a measure of people's material living conditions. But if policymakers care about people's feeling, then they should look into other measures such as subjective well-being. So here I would like to argue subjective well-being can be a good complement to GDP per capita, and it will not replace the GDP per capita measure. And for about downward sloping slope, there have been a lot of discussions around that. And I believe this question point out one good point is that that's true because GDP rises over time, people's aspiration rises. So this is one possible reason that the overall happiness measure is almost flat. Thank you.
A couple of states in the US use the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI, like Maryland and Vermont. Do you think there is value in the Genuine Progress Indicator, which incorporates measures for income inequality, household work, volunteer work, higher education, crime, and unemployment, and pollution?
Yeah, I think that's a very good approach to generate an indicator that that are not like just material well-being. And I think that's a very good attempt. And I think there are other indicators across globe that trying to make this attempt as well. And this one of the main reasons I think is researchers or policymakers started to realize the shortcoming of the GDP, of using GDP capita by itself to measure well-being in a country or across globe. Thank you.
One criticism of GDP per capita measurement as a way to measure societal welfare is that it doesn't take into account income inequality. Production, for example, may increase in an economy, but all the gains from that change could still accrue to those who are already the best off. Is there such a thing as subjective well-being inequality, of which we should be concerned as well? And if so, who are the 1%, so to speak, in terms of subjective well-being in our society?
That's a very good question. So in fact, these years, researchers begin to measure subjective well-being equality. But I have to say that the research in that stream is still, not very comprehensive. But in the past studies, we have seen that, for example, in China's development, people who are in the top income quintile, they get happier during the transition, while people from the bottom income quintile, they become less happy. So we do see that during a country's development or transition, subjective well-being inequality actually gets larger. That's also one of the problems subjective well-being researchers are currently investigating, and we are trying to see if there are any policy implications we can have from those case studies. Thank you.
How has the pandemic affected subjective well-being measures in the United States and around the world? Have there been studies done on this issue in the past year?
Thank you very much. This is a very recent topic. So I would encourage you to look into the most recent World Happiness Report, which was released in March the 20th, the World Happiness Day. In that report, we discuss first the ranking of countries during the pandemic year. And then in each chapter, we look into the pandemic on people's mental health, on the change in work mode, on people's happiness, and different like shutdown or lockdown measures on people's subjective well-being. In fact, in my chapter, the happiness and well-being in East Asia, we look into five East Asian regions, and we find that the rise in daily infection rates are negatively associated with people's happiness, we find the lockdown measures themselves are more stringent. Government policies are also negatively related to people's happiness. But when daily new infection rises, we find those stringent government policies actually have some protective effects. So they can protect people's happiness from decreasing if there is a rise in daily infection rates. So very brief answer to this question is yes, the COVID-19 pandemic have influenced people's subjective well-being, and those government policies can protect people's subjective well-being during this pandemic. Thank you.
Continuing the discussion of the pandemic's effect on subjective well-being, does subjective well-being have any way to incorporate the effect of deaths in society other than the negative effect of grief on those who survive, of course?
The deaths? You mean whether the deaths can be incorporated in those subjective well-being measure? I don't have an answer to this question in particular, but we do observe in our study in East Asia, the daily death rate is negatively associated with people's happiness. So we observe this correlation, but it's not currently incorporated in the subjective well-being measure. Another thing I would like to mention is in the past few years, in order to validate the subjective well-being measures, researchers have looked into the relationship between mortality and subjective well-being, and they find these two measures are highly negatively correlated. Thank you.
You mentioned that the fraction of the population that believes in God affects society-wide SWB, which might cut against the long liberal tradition of secularism in government. Should governments try to affect the religiosity of their citizens?
This is a very good question. So I would not say in any of the research studies that we suggest government should have this kind of intervention. One reason, as far as I'm concerned, is that in research studies on religiosity, we find the frequency of church attendance is not related to life satisfaction or happiness if we take into account people's self-evaluation of importance of God. So I would say government probably can urge people to go to church. That will include that will increase their church attendance, but the government cannot manipulate people's actual feeling about their believing in God. So I would not say government should do that, and they cannot do that, in fact.
This is going to be our last question. Many governments attempt to manipulate their GDP figures to make their country's economy look stronger than it really is. Have any attempts ever been made to manipulate subjective well-being measurement to make a country appear happier than it really is? And if subjective well-being measures become more popular in economic measurement, would you expect such efforts, and how could we try to limit them?
That's a very good question. So yes, as the subjective well-being measure become more popular, we do have this concern that citizens in certain countries, because they want to be ranked top among all the countries across globe, their citizens they want to answer like, yes, I'm happy in those public opinion surveys. So currently, we think we might observe this in the Gallup World Poll in the past waves, but here researchers haven't taken any step by now to do anything to eliminate those kind of manipulation. But so far, there haven't been like great efforts to manipulate these measures, but we will see what we can do when this measure become more popular. Thank you.
Before we close, we want to give you the opportunity to share any parting thoughts with the audience.
Yes, so I would like to encourage the audience to think about more about this new measure of well-being, that is the subjective evaluation of your own life as a measure of well-being to complement GDP per capita. This will have more valuable policy implications. And I would encourage you to read more books about happiness from economists, psychologists, and other disciplines to know more about this topic. Thank you very much.
On behalf of Claremont McKenna College and the Athenaeum, thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Fengyu Wu, to the Berger Institute for co-sponsoring this event, and to all of those who sent in their questions. Tonight is the final event of the Athenaeum Spring 2021 Speaker Series, and therefore the final event of our time as your Ath Fellows. For that reason, we'd like to conclude by extending some additional thank yous. First and foremost, we'd like to thank all of you. Whether tonight is your first Athenaeum talk or you're online with us at 5 p.m. Pacific several times each week, sharing these events with you has been a rare opportunity to experience community over the past year. While it's not how any of us would have hoped for or imagined, we're incredibly grateful to have had the opportunity to share a small piece of Claremont with all of you.
Like Will has noted, this has been an opportunity of a lifetime that I will forever hold close to my heart. There is one person who has been with us at almost every virtual Athenaeum behind the scenes, making sure that the webinar is running without a glitch. That person is Brian Hill from the CMC IT department. Thank you so much, Brian, for being on this journey with us and making sure it goes as smoothly as possible. The time and energy you have devoted to your craft and the app has not gone unnoticed.
Finally, we'd like to thank the person who none of this could have been possible without. Priya, you were tasked with adapting to an unconventional year in so many ways and found a way to put together an engaging, enlightening, wide-ranging, and topical program of speakers. As we all know, conducting our entire lives over Zoom has not been easy, but you somehow managed to build a virtual app that was never dull and still attracted students, parents, alumni, and friends, despite not having access to a delicious app dinner. None of this would have come to fruition without your vision and passion for the app. For that, we thank you for being such a force throughout this past year. I echo what all my co-fellows said before, and thank you all the audience for joining us a few times each week this year.
The app is looking forward to seeing you all again, hopefully in person in fall 2021. Until then, get vaccinated if you're eligible, stay engaged with CMC, and have a nice summer.
I just want to say something. I just want to say this is totally impromptu. I'm not prepared, but these Ath Fellows were amazing. I mean, this was something they did not sign up for, and they have done a brilliant job. If people could see them behind the scenes, writing up the questions, coming up with questions, moving questions around, they would just be blown away. So I feel so lucky to have had this trio in behind the scenes with us all this year. Thank you so much, Will, Chris, Nandini. You guys are amazing, amazing. Thank you.